Everyone thinks they know Severus Snape, the cold, sarcastic professor in the dungeons, the Death Eater who killed Albus Dumbledore, the man Harry Potter hated. But what if I told you that the story you know is only the mask, and that behind that mask was a life defined by loneliness, impossible choices, and sacrifices so deep they could never be repaid? Think about it. You grow up in a home where love is scarce and cruelty is constant. Your only escape is the hidden world of magic, a place you think will save you. You arrive at Hogwarts full of hope, only to be sorted into the one house that will forever mark you as suspicious in the eyes of most of the school. Your brilliance in potions, your deep understanding of magic, your sharp wit, they don't win you admiration. They make you a target. And yet, you find one bright thread in that tapestry of isolation, a friend. Lily Evans. A connection so rare that it becomes the center of your world. But you lose her. Not because of one moment, but because of 1,000 choices, regrets, and the widening gap between who you are and who you wish you could be. Then the war comes. You join the wrong side, thinking you're seizing power, only to realize too late the cost of that allegiance. And when you finally try to make it right, you discover that redemption comes at a price. Your life will no longer be your own. You'll be bound to a mission where every kind act must be hidden, every victory claimed by someone else, and every cruelty you commit must look genuine, or people will die. At Hogwarts, you're forced to play the role of the villain to protect the very children who fear you. You're hated by your colleagues, hunted by your enemies, distrusted by your allies. And the cruelest part? The one person you've spent your life trying to honor will never see the lengths you've gone to in her name. This is the untold story of Severus Snape. The real story. Not the one written in history books or whispered in Gryffindor common rooms, but the one hidden in shadows, woven from secret meetings with Dumbledore, impossible vows, and the constant danger of being found out by either side. It's the story of a man who saved countless lives and died with no glory, no honor, no gravestone in the Hogwarts grounds. A man who, in the eyes of the wizarding world, will always be remembered for the worst thing he ever did, never the reason he did it. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. Right now, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Are you settling in for the night, watching this as part of your bedtime ritual? Or are you in the middle of the day, escaping into the wizarding world for a moment's peace? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and it's amazing to see just how far these stories travel. And while you're here, if you're one of the 93% of people who watch these videos but aren't subscribed yet, yes, you heard that right, 93%, now is the perfect time to change that. Click that like button so the algorithm knows this story is worth sharing, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this journey. It's quick, it's free, and it's the single biggest thing you can do to help this channel grow and bring you more stories like this one. Some men are born into greatness, others into love. Severus Snape was born into neither. The row of brick houses along Spinner's End crouch beneath the iron sky like tired old men, their windows dim, their chimneys coughing soot into the wet air. The river beyond ran sluggish and black, carrying the chemical stink of the mills. On days like this, which was to say, most days, the street felt like the end of the world. Severus sat on the uneven step outside number 8, elbows on his knees, chin in his hands. The drizzle worked its way down his collar, chilling the narrow space between skin and shirt. He did not move. If he stayed still long enough, perhaps his parents would forget to notice him. Inside, the shouting had begun early, a slammed door, his mother's clipped, cutting voice, his father's growl in reply. A bottle rolled across the floorboards. He had stopped trying to make out the words years ago. They never changed, only repeated like an ugly charm. He heard his name once, spat more than spoken. That was his cue. Without looking back, he slipped down the stone path, his too big coat flapping around his ankles. The fabric smelled faintly of potion fumes, the lingering scent of an experiment gone right, for once, and of the cupboard under the stairs where he hid his supplies. Severus kept to the edge of the street, away from the lamplight, past shuttered shop fronts and the silent loom factory. He knew every crack in the pavement, every gap in the fence along the riverbank. The others, the factory children, the boys who threw stones, didn't come here. It was here, among the reeds and the ripple of dark water, that he first saw her. A flash of copper hair in the grey, a girl leaning over the bank with her shoes in the grass. She was laughing at something the river had done, a dart of fish, perhaps, or the tug of a current. Magic clung to her like sunlight, invisible but undeniable. He felt it before he understood it. And in that moment, though he could not have said why, Severus knew two things with absolute certainty. First, that she was like him, different, strange, set apart. Second, that the rest of his life would be divided into the years before he met her, and the years after. He stepped forward, the wet grass whispering underfoot. "You're a witch," he said. She turned, startled, green eyes bright against the drear of Spinner's End. And for the first time in his memory, someone smiled at him without malice. The mills marked the hours with their groan and clatter, but Severus learned to keep a different time by the river. The water moved with a patience that Spinner's End did not understand, black and slick beneath the soot, gathering whispers of distant places and carrying them past the skeletal reeds. He returned there because the world at home was made of corners and cuffs and the hollow thud of a bottle against wood, and because the river gave him a vantage from which to study the one anomaly of brightness that had unsettled his careful observation of misery. She came often, the girl with copper hair that caught every fugitive thread of light in Cokeworth. She came with a sister whose smile was tight and whose hands were always clean, even after tugging at the wet grass. The younger one moved as if the air itself had learned to bend for her, leaves turned in her wake, petals unfolded without sun, a jump from a height ended in a soft, laughing tumble rather than a bruise. Severus watched from a distance at first, cataloguing. The incidents were neither random nor reckless. They showed intention without instruction, a natural grammar of magic. He began to adjust his routes to intersect with theirs. He built a map of likely afternoons and safe sightlines, places where a thin boy could be no more than a fence-post shadow. In time the distance shrank. Curiosity, for him, had always been a force stronger than fear. He had known the shape of power in ingredients and ratios, in the quiet dominion of a flame, but this was different. This was power that bloomed from the self, unbottled, unrefined, as if the world had found a reason to be kind. When he finally stepped into their orbit, it changed the river's mathematics. The younger sister did not treat him as a trespasser. She listened, and when he explained the nature of their difference, he did it with the precision of a boy who had been born to observe from behind a cracked door. He laid out the facts as he knew them. There was a school that trained their kind, there were others like them hidden in plain sight, there was a history beneath the city's coal and brick older than the mills. He never needed to invent wonders, the world already contained them. He only needed to name them. She absorbed each revelation with a fierce, private joy. The older sister did not. Her discomfort grew in proportion to the younger's delight. Severus recognized jealousy the way a miner recognizes a seam. It ran in Cokeworth as predictably as iron, and it could be just as hard. The older one began to collect ordinary explanations with the zeal of a collector, lucky wind, sound footing, childish fancy. She clutched them as talismans against a future that seemed to have passed her by. Severus kept his distance from her when he could, and endured her when he could not. He understood resentment too intimately to be careless with it. The friendship that formed between the boy from Spinner's End and the girl by the river did not grow like a storybook vine, up and outward toward display. It grew downward first, setting roots in small, sturdy rituals. They met where the reeds made a kind of crooked room. They exchanged specimens and secrets. He showed her how certain weeds, boiled under a low flame, released scents that could quiet a headache or sharpen attention. She showed him, without meaning to, how wonder could be an antidote to bitterness. He tried not to resent the ease with which she learned. He failed only sometimes. At home, Severus drafted and redrafted lists on scraps of paper filched from drawers and bins, herbs worth collecting, likely reagents from the local apothecary's waste, small experiments with low risk of detection. His mother's old notes, elegant, precise, written in a hand that had grown scarce in their house, guided him where they could. Eileen Prince's knowledge had become a private inheritance, unacknowledged in the rooms where Tobias Snape's temper presided, but persistent in the boy who slept beside her battered trunk. He learned that discipline was a form of shelter. He learned that order could be imposed on chaos molecule by molecule. The letters came in their time, late summer bowing toward autumn. The river thickened with chill, and the mills seemed to complain more loudly, as if winter were a burden they were tired of bearing. The owls, when they came, proved that magic did not care for the courtesy of secrecy when it had a point to make. Severus read his envelope alone, hunched beneath the stair where the air stood still and the dust smelt of wood and old wool. Acceptance was not a surprise in the logical sense, it was a sequence completing itself. Yet the sight of the crest and the careful ink did something unscientific in his chest. The girl by the river received her own letter. News traveled between them at once, unencumbered by the older sister's frost or by the practical concerns of the Evans household. Severus measured his joy carefully, as one measures volatile essence. He did not want to spill it. He knew enough of human reactions to anticipate complications. Children left behind often reached for cruelty, adults with a tenuous grasp on respectability reached for rules. He prepared for both. Preparation, however, could not blunt the inevitabilities of difference. The older sister's distance hardened. The parents, kind in the ordinary ways of kind people who did not understand, asked questions that could not be answered to their satisfaction. Severus felt the familiar heat of shame rise when the conversation turned, inevitably, toward his address, his father's work, the fact that coal seeped into clothes and never fully washed out. He had not expected their world to make room for him. He had expected only that the other world would. He and the girl walked the riverbanks through those last days of summer, taking stock. He drew maps in his head of corridors he had never seen. He imagined the precise smell of library dust, the texture of parchment that had not been salvaged from a bin, the taste of silence in a room where silence was not a prelude to shouting. He imagined classrooms where their kind of difference lined up in neat rows and wrote itself into ledgers. He imagined mastery as a shape he could finally grow into. Sometimes he glanced sideways at her and thought about the sorting. He did not think in terms of good and evil, those had always seemed like blunt tools. He thought instead of temperament and method. Ambition, in his mind, was not a sin, it was a survival tactic. He could feel Slytherin like a magnetic pull along the grain of his bones. He wondered where the hat would see her. He did not resent the likelihood that it would see her elsewhere. Love and allegiance were not the same thing, he had already learned, and the world was not obliged to spare him reminders. He practiced restraint. He practiced occlumency in its earliest, inexact child's form, the compartmentalization of thought, the tidy stacking of fear and hope in separate boxes. He rehearsed neutrality on his face for the day he would need it. The mills were good for this kind of rehearsal, they taught endurance not through instruction but through constant, unchosen test. He took their lessons and refined them into something quieter and more precise. A handful of small moments threaded themselves into memory before departure, a sprig of willow that refused to wilt, a dragonfly that hovered in place as if waiting for permission, the exact way the girl's laughter made the river seem less black. He knew, even then, that memory could be a knife or a key. He tried to store these as keys. On the final evening, the sky over Cokeworth turned the color of cooled iron. Severus packed with the economy of someone who had never owned anything that could not be lost. Into his trunk went his mother's notes, a small pouch of collected plant matter, a repaired cauldron with a dent he could navigate around, and a book with a spine he had mended 3 times. He left space for the things he intended to acquire, knowledge first, then the means to keep it safe from the demands of other people's narratives. The train would come, and with it, a division that would feel inevitable only in hindsight. Childhood would end not with ceremony but with a list, a platform, and the huff of a great scarlet engine. He would step into an order of things built for the exceptional and discover that even among the exceptional there were hierarchies as rigid as any mill shift. He would learn the names of those hierarchies, learn how to work beneath them and around them, and, when necessary, through them. For now, he stood at the river's edge one last time before leaving, the soot-stained water moving at its unhurried pace. Somewhere upstream the mills labored, somewhere downstream the current widened toward a city that did not know his name. Between those 2 points, he found a narrow, private equilibrium. It was not happiness. It was not even hope, not exactly. It was the acknowledgement of a path that had revealed itself and the cold resolve to walk it. In the years ahead, the world would come to know the boy from Spinner's End as a man who never smiled except to wound. They would speak of his cruelty before his competence, his bitterness before his brilliance, and they would not, could not, account for the feverish prayer of a child who once stood beside a poisoned river and promised himself he would never again be powerless. None of that mattered to the river. None of it mattered to the mills. It mattered to him. He turned from the water and made for home, where a trunk waited and a night would pass and a morning would arrive that would claim him for a place older than any mill and stricter than any shift. In that future, there would be houses and rivalries and griefs and choices. For now, there was only the steady practice of leaving, which is to say, the first discipline he ever mastered. The train's windows reflected more than the platform, they reflected the parting of 2 worlds. Severus sat alone in a compartment, Lily's voice faint down the corridor as she found a place among others, the chatter of strangers already folding her into their circles. Steam blurred the glass until the station disappeared, and the rhythm of the wheels took over, a steady, mechanical certainty that had nothing to do with the unpredictable shifts of home. Hogwarts rose from the darkness like something conjured rather than built, its towers pricking the starlit sky, its windows glowing against the cold night. The castle was older than anything in Spinner's End, older than the mills, older than the grudges that clung to them both. He stepped onto the damp grass with the rest of the first years, keeping to the edge of the group, cataloguing faces the way he would ingredients, by potential danger, potential usefulness. The great hall opened around them, immense and echoing, the floating candles shedding warm light on the expectant faces at full long tables. Above, the enchanted ceiling mirrored the night sky, the constellations arranged in their proper places, precise and mathematical. Severus's eyes lingered on the high table, noting the adults who watched with varying degrees of boredom, curiosity, and calculation. Somewhere in that array of robes and wands were people who would shape the next 7 years of his life. When his name was called, he walked to the sorting hat without hurry. Sitting on the stool, the brim settled low over his brow, and the voice arrived. Quiet, immediate, and knowing. Clever, whispered the hat, the word stretching like a hand weighing a coin. Very clever. A mind as quick as yours could make fine use of Ravenclaw's libraries. Knowledge is power, Severus thought, but power is not always granted to those who deserve it. Ambition. A taste for influence. And I see a willingness to endure what others would flee. You'd go far in Slytherin. The hat sifted through his memories as if turning pages, the hiss of arguments through thin walls, the sting of humiliation in the playground, the glint of a silver necklace pressed into Lily's palm in secret. You could do well in Ravenclaw. You could be safe in Hufflepuff, though I doubt you'd stand the boredom. But in Slytherin you could gather the tools you want, and the protection you'll need. Protection. The word lodged deep. He saw Lily across the hall, her face intent, her eyes searching for him. He imagined her name being called, her steps toward another table. The hat felt the flicker of attachment and the heavier weight of resentment, the awareness that affection was not armor. Slytherin, then, the hat concluded, decisive now. You'll find your equals there, and perhaps your betters. And when you have learned what you must, you will know how to turn even their strengths to your advantage. The brim lifted, and the hall heard the decision. Applause rose from the table nearest the dungeons. He slid from the stool, not looking toward Lily as he walked. The Slytherin table opened a space for him between two older boys whose eyes measured him as coolly as he measured them. The feast unfolded in a blur of silver goblets and steaming platters. Severus ate little, watching the flow of alliances and the easy familiarity of those who had known each other before tonight. Above, the ceiling stars shone on without heat. Somewhere in the castle's deep heart, rooms waited to be claimed, rules to be tested, secrets to be learned. In the common room that night, the air was thick with the smell of the lake beyond the walls and the faint salt of ambition. Severus lay in his narrow bed, the sounds of shifting blankets and murmured boasts around him, and thought of the hat's final words, about equals, betters, and the turning of strengths. He thought of Lily at her table across the hall, separated now by more than a strip of stone and wood. He thought of the years ahead, of the work required to forge a place where no one could shove him out of the way. In Spinner's End, survival had been a matter of endurance. Here, it would be a matter of skill. And skill was something he could control. In the morning, the castle's timetable would dictate his movements. He would be assigned teachers, books, and rules. He would begin learning the kind of magic that did not have to hide under a bed or in a cupboard. And with each lesson, he would move closer to the thing he had already decided he wanted most, a power that no one could take from him, not even the people he cared for. For now, he closed his eyes and listened to the muffled heartbeat of the castle, the low, constant pulse of a place that would shape him, sharpen him, and one day, demand a price. The castle awarded status with effortless precision. Some students wore it like a second uniform, inherited along with names that opened doors. Others earned it with brilliance, charisma, or the kind of charm that turned infractions into folklore. Severus learned quickly that there was another kind of status too, the kind no one wanted, the usefulness of being a target. It began as games in corridors and escalated into rituals. Hexes flew when proctors were absent, books slipped from hands at inopportune moments, ink bled across parchment that had taken a night to perfect. Laughter did the rest, carrying the memory forward so that the next incident arrived preloaded with an audience. The perpetrators were a set with a name other people said with fondness, for boys who moved through the school as if the air parted out of habit. They were clever, quick, and admired, which is to say, they were dangerous. Severus responded first with calculation. He learned the geography of vulnerability, the blind corners, the echoes that preceded footfalls, the classes where a teacher's interest wandered. He mapped the rhythms of the day to minimize exposure and hoarded minutes in unused classrooms where he could study without interruption. He ranked spells by reliability under stress and practiced them until they became muscle memory. He learned to keep his wand in reach without seeming to fidget. There were days when planning failed. Sunshine pulled students onto the grounds and turned the lake into an amphitheater, and on one such afternoon the ritual reached its inevitable crescendo. A casual humiliation became spectacle, and a private enmity became school entertainment. The hex that lifted him was not elegant, but it was efficient, and the roar of approval that followed proved once again that cruelty, given a stage, requires little explanation. He hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury and understood with the cold clarity that accompanies pain that some victories are secured not by strength but by narrative. In that narrative, he was the villain in training. The heroes were boys whose mischief gleamed like medals. Afterward, the castle felt altered. A line had been crossed that could not be erased by time or achievement. Severus stored the moment in the same cabinet where he kept other volatile substances, labeled and sealed, ready to be distilled into something useful. The storage did not dull the heat of it. It simply redirected it. Work became the counterweight. In potions he achieved the kind of mastery that refuses to be ignored. Ratios obeyed him, heat curved to intention, reagents yielded their secrets earlier for him than for others. The professor took note with a blend of approval and caution. Invitations to favored gatherings circulated unevenly. He was included when talent could not be denied and sidelined when the room required a smoother social fit. None of it mattered as much as the laboratory's truth. Precision did not care about lineage. Defense, too, became a proving ground. His approach was unsentimental, rooted in mechanics rather than bravado. He studied the construction of curses and the architecture of counters, tracing energies along pathways until their weak points revealed themselves. His notebooks thickened with annotations and marginal inventions. New gestures were tested, adjusted, and set aside for later refinement. Some experiments left marks on furniture and, once, on skin. He concealed the latter and improved the former. Rumors traveled along their own supply lines. It was said that he kept troubling company, boys whose family names were eventually whispered in darker contexts. It was also said that he knew things about one of the admired for that ought not to be knowable. Curiosity and suspicion fed each other, and one evening a reckless dare sent him to a place the administration had built for secrecy, not for visitors. The tree outside it fought like a living sentinel, and the creature within did not know the difference between a classmate and prey. Intervention arrived at the final possible moment, and the price of survival was a vow of silence that served the reputations of those who had engineered the risk in the first place. The lesson was unambiguous: systems protect their favored sons. Hatred settled in him not as a flare but as sediment, layer on layer, compacting into something solid. He did not mistake it for purpose, but he recognized its utility. It made long nights feel justified. It sharpened study into craft, craft into innovation. It explained why he could look at a page of instructions and find 3 improvements before reaching the second line. It explained the appeal of branches of magic that rewarded ambition with immediate results. His relationship with the girl from the river became strained in proportion to these developments. She persisted in kindness even when it should have seemed ill-advised, and he persisted in pragmatism even when it should have seemed unkind. Their houses braided them into opposing tapestries with every feast and victory. She found welcome among the admired, he found shelter among those who did not flinch at unsentimental conclusions. Neither arrangement was entirely comfortable. Both felt inevitable. Through it all, he continued to catalogue. He kept lists of patterns in the 4 boys' movements, of professors who looked away and those who intervened, of prefects who calculated reputational risk before deciding whether to care. He noted which hexes were chosen for humiliation and which for damage, as if taking an inventory of a shop he planned to own one day. He learned that spectacle prefers spells that leave no permanent mark, and he learned how to remove those marks faster than anyone else. By the end of that year, his notebooks had become a second education. Some pages held improvements to standard brews that reduced instability and increased potency. Others contained jinxes trimmed for efficiency or counters shaved down to their essential gestures, arranged like equations solved to their simplest form. A handful of entries were fenced around with caution marks, their headings written in a hand more careful than the rest. He did not show those pages to anyone. He did not even read them on days when his temper ran hot. In the quiet of the Slytherin dormitory, beneath the pressure of the lake, Severus lay awake and replayed the season like a series of experiments. Each began with a hypothesis: stand here, avoid this corridor, keep this class error free, and ended with data points measured in bruises or in the absence of them. The results were clear. The castle rewarded story, connections, and charm. It tolerated excellence as long as excellence remained polite. It punished those who challenged the distribution of either. He adjusted accordingly. The boy who had once relied on endurance began to rely on refinement. If the world insisted on casting him as an antagonist, he would make of that role something formidable. If survival here depended on a craft sharpened to a fine edge, he would learn to hone it without cutting himself open. And if power could be coaxed out of letters in the margins where no one else thought to look, he would write himself a future there, line by precise line. In Spinner's End, survival had meant keeping quiet in the right rooms and moving quickly through the wrong ones. At Hogwarts, survival meant something far more intricate, an ongoing experiment in control. The boy who arrived with nothing but a trunk of worn belongings and a head full of potion theory now measured his days by the precision of his work and the sharpness of his observations. He had learned, in the space of 3 short years, that the world rarely rewarded merit for its own sake. Those who commanded respect often did so by birthright or by weaving themselves into stories that made people want to cheer for them. Severus had no such luxury. What he did have was the ability to turn information into advantage, to take humiliation and distill it into something that could be used later. It was not a kind education, but it was a thorough one. We have seen him make his first true connection with Lily Evans, a fragile bridge between 2 different worlds. We have seen him claimed by Slytherin House, a choice made as much by necessity as by nature. And we have watched the slow tightening of the Marauder's circle around him, turning casual hostility into public sport. Already, the seeds are there, ambition fed by resentment, skill sharpened by exclusion, and a guardedness that will one day become a shield no one can pierce. But the castle's lessons are not finished with him. Ahead lies the moment that will break the last unshaken piece of his life, the incident that severs the one friendship he values, not by accident, but by a choice that will haunt him. There are darker rooms yet to enter, conversations behind closed doors that will set him on a path toward a mark burned into the skin. Before long, the boy from Spinner's End will find himself standing at the threshold of power, love, and ruin, 3 forces that, in his world, often arrive in the same breath. The question is not whether he will choose between them. The question is how much of himself will be left once he has. The spring of 5th year brought with it a deceptive gentleness. Sunlight lingered on the lawns, the lake's surface lay calm enough to mirror the sky, and the scent of lilacs drifted from the greenhouses down to the courtyards. Beneath it all, the castle's hierarchies continued their work, invisible as roots beneath grass. For Severus, the days were measured less by the calendar than by a series of calculations: where to walk, when to arrive, which corners to avoid. Exams loomed, and with them, the restless energy that made corridors more volatile. That energy found its outlet one afternoon near the lake, when the admired for had drawn a crowd without even trying. Books forgotten, students leaned in for the performance they expected, one in which Severus Snape would play his assigned role. The opening moves were familiar, a jinx to disarm him, a hex to lift him, the laughter rolling out in waves as if cued. The sun made it worse. Everything was brighter, sharper, harder to ignore. He landed hard, robes tangled, and reached for his wand with a reflex born of long practice. The countercurse came fast, precise enough to silence the hex but not the laughter. A remark followed, cutting, personal, and the crowd's reaction burned hotter than the sun overhead. He searched for a foothold, an escape in dignity if not in ground. What he found instead was Lily, breaking through the circle, her voice cutting across the noise. It was not the rescue that stung, it was the look. pity, concern, and something else he could not name, something that weighed more than the humiliation itself. The next moments were not planned. They were the collision of pride and rage, each amplifying the other. Words came that should have stayed caged. The air seemed to tighten around them as the single syllable left his mouth, a word with the weight of every old bitterness, every unspoken grievance. It struck harder than any curse he knew, and the silence that followed was the kind that reshapes the landscape. The crowd shifted, no longer entertained but satisfied, as if they had witnessed something irreversible. Lily's expression changed in a way he would replay for years afterward, looking for a point at which it might have been undone. She turned away, and the space she left behind felt larger than the lake. In the days that followed, attempts at repair fell short. Apologies, in his experience, were tools for bargaining, and this was not a bargain she would make. She moved differently now, her path bending toward people he had spent years disdaining. The conversations that once threaded easily between them became brief, transactional, and eventually absent. Without that anchor, the rest of his world shifted. The boys in his house who had been companions of convenience became confidants of necessity. Their ambitions matched his in shape if not in detail, and their circles overlapped with the darker edges of the wizarding world. The rhetoric was intoxicating, talk of strength, of destiny, of remaking a world that had kept them at its margins. By the year's end, the idea of aligning himself with that rising power no longer seemed like a distant possibility. It seemed like the logical next step. The word that had driven Lily away was still a wound, but in the echoed chamber of the slithering common room, it became something else, a declaration, a sorting not by hat but by choice. Severus understood, perhaps better than most, that choices have a way of narrowing the path ahead. He also understood that once a path narrowed far enough, it began to feel inevitable. An inevitability, he told himself, was easier to live with than regret. Summer in Spinner's End was no softer than the winters. The mill's smoke hung heavy in the air, the river crawled under its layer of filth, and the shouting in the Snape household resumed its role as the background hum of every day. Yet Severus returned from Hogwarts with a new kind of insulation, an inner distance that even the narrow rooms and coal dust could not touch. The final severance from Lily had stripped away the last constraint on his loyalties. What remained was focus. He kept to his room, the small space above the kitchen where the air grew stifling by midday. Here, surrounded by the scent of parchment, potion ingredients, and the faint mildew of the walls, he worked through notes from the year. He refined jinxes for speed, pared down incantations until they could be whispered under breath, and brewed with the precision of someone who understood that mastery was not an academic exercise but a form of currency. Letters came from school acquaintances whose influence stretched far beyond Hogwarts walls. They spoke in the language of opportunity, gatherings where certain ideas could be discussed without the scrutiny of teachers, invitations to meet families whose names were etched into wizarding history. There were promises, not always spoken outright, of belonging to something greater than the rigid divisions of school houses. By the time 6th year began, those promises had shape. In the hidden corners of the castle and in houses far from watchful eyes, Severus found himself in rooms thick with incense and certainty. The conversations there were different from anything taught in class. Lineage as a form of strength, magic as a means to impose order rather than merely preserve it, power as a right claimed rather than earned. The ideology fit neatly over the resentments he carried, like a cloak tailored to his exact frame. Some faces in these rooms would, in time, be whispered about with fear. Others already were. Severus listened more than he spoke, weighing each statement against what he knew of the world outside. The rhetoric was intoxicating, but what hooked him was not the speeches, it was the access. Advanced spells exchanged in low tones, cursed objects examined with the reverence of rare treasures, and the kind of magical theory that flourished in the absence of restraint. When the mark was offered, it was not with ceremony so much as with inevitability. A summons to a gathering on the edge of the school year, a circle of cloaked figures, the leader's voice as silken as it was commanding. The air thickened with the scent of dark magic as the wand's tip touched skin. Pain flared, sharp and searing, but Severus held his arm steady. The sting was nothing compared to the clarity that followed, a sense of place, of having stepped through a door that could never be closed. The mark pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat for days afterward. It was more than a sign, it was a tether, a constant reminder that he was now bound to a cause that promised him power, respect, and the tools to ensure he would never again be at the mercy of others' narratives. Back in the Slytherin common room, life went on as before. Classes resumed, professors assigned work, the castle's petty rivalries played out in the corridors. But under the surface, Severus carried something new. Where once he had sought shelter in knowledge, he now sought dominance through it. Where once he had been merely an outsider navigating hostile ground, he was now a player in a much larger game. And in the quiet moments, those rare, unguarded intervals between study and sleep, he understood that every step forward in this new allegiance was also a step away from the boy who had once stood by a river and felt the thrill of discovery without cost. That boy was gone. In his place stood someone who had chosen his side, and whose arm now bore the proof. The war that had once been spoken of in whispers now moved in plain sight. Disappearances made the front pages of the Prophet, whispers of torture and coercion seeped through the halls of the ministry. For Severus, still technically a student but already marked, the boundaries between school and the world beyond it had dissolved. The castle's stone corridors felt narrower, its classes less relevant. His true education happened elsewhere, in dimly lit rooms where plans were made and orders given. It was in service to that education that he found himself at the Hog's Head on a raw, wind-cut evening. The pub was a place of stale ale and unwashed floors, far removed from the polish of the three broomsticks. Here, cloaked figures came and went without lingering in the doorway. Here, questions were a currency no one spent freely. Severus took a back corner, where shadows gathered thick against the wall, and waited for the contact he was meant to meet. Instead, a different conversation reached him. Through the thin partition between rooms came a voice, measured, deliberate, tinged with the sort of authority that could hold an audience in place. The speaker was a woman, her words slow and heavy, each one dragging some unseen weight behind it. She spoke of a child not yet born, one who would possess the power to defeat the Dark Lord. She spoke of the 7th month, of parents defying him, of a fate that seemed already written. Severus leaned closer, the wood grain of the wall pressing cold against his cheek. He caught only part of it. Enough to understand that what he had heard was dangerous. Enough to know that the Dark Lord would want it. By the time the meeting he had come for concluded, his course was set. That same night, he carried the prophecy to his master. The Dark Lord listened without interruption, his pale eyes fixed and unblinking. When Severus finished, there was no praise, no comment, only the faintest curve of satisfaction at the edge of the mouth. The dismissal was abrupt, the weight of his own words following him out into the cold. Days later, the reality of what he had delivered came into focus. In Slytherin's underground common room, news spread through careful whispers. The Dark Lord had begun hunting a family. The Potters. James and Lily. The name struck like a physical blow. Until that moment, the prophecy had been a puzzle without pieces, an abstract chain of cause and effect. Now the links were visible, and one of them led directly to the girl he had known before ambition, before allegiances. The mark on his arm had never felt heavier. Regret, sharp and immediate, cut through the layers of calculation that usually buffered him from consequence. But regret alone was nothing. Action was the only currency left to spend, and the cost of undoing even part of the damage would be high. He knew where he had to go, and who he had to face, to even attempt it. The choice was no longer between the boy he had been and the man he had become. It was between doing nothing and watching Lily's life become another casualty in a war he had helped to arm, or stepping into a new role entirely, one that would make him more alone than he had ever been. The road to Dumbledore's office felt longer than it ever had, each step measured against the consequences of what he was about to do. Severus knew the headmaster would be awake. The man seemed to exist outside the usual rhythms of the castle. Torches guttered in the corridor as if uneasy with his presence, and the stair to the office turned under his weight with slow, deliberate revolutions. Dumbledore listened without interruption as Severus spoke. The words came in fragments, stripped of the precision he preferred, urgency making a mess of structure. He told of the prophecy, of how much the Dark Lord knew, and of who was now in his sights. He did not name James except where necessary. It was Lily's name that anchored every sentence. The headmaster's expression remained unreadable, his hands folded neatly before him. When Severus reached the end, there was no immediate comfort, no assurance. Only a question: what would he give in return for her protection? The answer came before the thought had finished forming. Anything. The word felt absolute, its scope limitless. From that moment, the terms were set. Dumbledore would work to keep Lily safe. In return, Severus would serve him, not in open allegiance but in secrecy. His place in the Dark Lord's ranks would remain intact, his loyalty, invisible to everyone but the man across the desk. It would mean living between two masters, each capable of destroying him for betrayal. When Lily died despite every bargain made, the weight of that agreement shifted. Dumbledore asked him to protect the boy, her boy. It was not framed as repayment. It was framed as a way to honor what she had been, and perhaps to atone for what had been set in motion. The request was almost unbearable, yet refusal was never an option. The mark on his arm bound him to one side, the vow to Dumbledore bound him to another, and between them lay a narrow path lined with suspicion and danger. Each day ahead would be lived in the shadow of both allegiances, neither able to claim him entirely, both demanding everything. It was in that office, under the silent gaze of portraits who had seen centuries of such bargains, that Severus Snape stepped into the life that would define him. The double life, the thankless task, the quiet, grinding war fought in the space between two enemies. And as he left, the door closing behind him, the truth settled like cold iron: whatever happened from here, there would be no going back. Hogwarts in September looked the same as it had in his own school days, stone polished by centuries of footsteps, banners hanging heavy with house colors, the clamor of students reuniting after summer. But for Severus, the castle was no longer a place of learning. It was a theater, and he had been cast in a role that demanded a performance every waking hour. He took his seat at the staff table with the rest of the professors, eye scanning the hall with the detachment of a surveyor measuring land. The years had been unkind in the ways he had expected, lines deepened where tension had lived, the skin around his eyes drawn tighter from long nights spent calculating the space between survival and exposure. He had returned not as a student, but as a watchman, one whose post required him to keep the very object of his watch at arm's length. The potions classroom became his stronghold. Its cool, dim air was laced with the scent of crushed herbs and simmering brews, the low flame of the cauldrons offering a rhythm he could control when so much else could not be. Here, discipline was absolute. Students learned quickly that precision was not optional, and that even minor errors could summon a sharp correction. The mask of disdain served him well. It kept questions brief, conversations transactional, and trust out of reach. Among the staff, his reputation settled quickly. Some found him useful, others found him intolerable. He neither courted nor resisted either view. What mattered was that no one suspected the full truth. That the man who stood in the dungeons, enforcing order with clipped words and narrowed eyes, was also feeding information to the headmaster in the privacy of shadowed corridors. In the evenings, the other professors lingered in the staff room, trading stories and complaints over tea or sherry. Severus spent those hours in his chambers, sorting through scraps of intelligence collected under the guise of old acquaintanceships. Every interaction with the Death Eaters was another step along a wire-drawn taut between two towers. One misstep in either direction meant the fall. Harry Potter's arrival was years away, but already the ghost of Lily's promise followed him through the corridors. Every decision, every report to Dumbledore, carried the unspoken weight of that night in the headmaster's office. He would keep the boy safe when the time came, not for the boy's sake, but for hers. For now, his task was simpler in form, though no less dangerous in substance. Play the part of the bitter, exacting teacher while serving as the unseen link between Hogwarts and the war beyond its walls. The mask would become his face in the eyes of the students, and that was by design. The less they knew, the longer he could keep doing the work that needed to be done. And so the term began, each day indistinguishable on the surface but threaded with the quiet tension of a man who lived in the gap between appearance and truth, preparing for a future in which that gap would become a chasm. To live a double life was to dismantle the self and rebuild it into compartments. Severus had learned this long before the dark mark had burned into his skin or Dumbledore's vow had chained him to another master. As a child, the compartments were crude, one for the things said aloud, another for the things thought but never spoken, and a third for the dangerous truths that could not even be admitted to himself. Now, the architecture of his mind was a fortress. Each room was sealed, each door locked from the inside. The man who stalked the dungeon corridors, robes whispering against cold stone, was a construct, a deliberate distortion built to repel curiosity. He let the students believe in the cruelty, the favoritism, the cutting remarks that could wither confidence faster than a blight on a plant. Those beliefs were useful, they kept eyes from searching deeper. Inside the fortress, however, the truth was less simple. There was satisfaction in mastery, of potions, of spells, of control over a room that answered to his will, but it was always shadowed by vigilance. A single word out of place to the wrong listener could unmake years of careful positioning. He played the Death Eater convincingly because the truth was dangerous to both sides. To the Dark Lord, he could never admit the scale of his betrayal. To Dumbledore, he could never confess the toll it took to wear the mask without pause. The cost was isolation, though isolation was hardly new to him. The difference now was that it was strategic rather than circumstantial. Relationships, even casual ones, created threads, and threads could be pulled until the whole design unraveled. He could afford neither confidant nor witness. His only conversation partners were the silent shelves of jars and books in his chambers, the low bubble of cauldrons like the breathing of an old friend who kept every secret. At night, when the castle's heartbeat slowed and even the portrait seemed to sleep, the compartments in his mind loosened just enough for the memories to move. Lily's face appeared unbidden, not as she had been at the end, cold, closed off, but as she had been by the river, sunlight in her hair, the water bending around her ankles. That image was both anchor and weight, keeping him steady while reminding him of the exact depth to which he had fallen. In those moments, he wondered, not for the first time, if the boy she had once known would recognize what he had become, or if he would see only the mask. The answer was academic. The boy was gone, the mask permanent, and the work ahead allowed for no looking back. Secrecy was not just a shield now, it was the foundation of his existence. And so, day after day, Severus Snape walked the narrow path between two enemies, speaking in two languages, living in two worlds, and belonging entirely to neither. The letter arrived before the first feast of term, carried on the wing beats of an owl that seemed to recognize him only enough to disdain him. Its seal was official, Hogwarts standard, and its contents brief, a list of new first years, complete with house placements and the names of their guardians. There it was. Potter, Harry. Greyfinder. The name struck like an echo, pulling with it every image and sound from a past he had disciplined himself not to revisit too often. James's smirk as the crowd roared, Lily's voice rising in protest, the hiss of a word that had cost him everything. Severus set the parchment down on the desk and, for a moment, simply stared at it. He had known this was coming, had been preparing for it, in fact, but the anticipation had not dulled the impact. The first time he saw the boy in the flesh was in the Great Hall. Small, thin, dark hair untidy to the point of rebellion. The resemblance to James was immediate and exact, the same bone structure, the same infuriating air of someone who belonged without ever having to earn it. But then the boy looked up and the eyes, Lily's eyes, fixed on him with open, curious assessment. For a fraction of a heartbeat, the mask threatened to slip. He forced it back into place, his expression settling into the familiar lines of disapproval and cold regard. It was safer to let the boy believe he was disliked from the outset. Affection, or even fairness, would invite attention, and attention would put them both in danger. The headmaster's charge had been clear: keep him safe. It had said nothing about keeping him comfortable. In the classroom, Potter proved to be exactly the complication Severus had anticipated. His fame preceded him like a herald, and the Gryffindors responded with the kind of unearned loyalty that Severus had always found intolerable. Worse, the boy carried himself with the unconscious confidence of someone used to being watched with admiration. Each time Severus corrected him sharply, a part of him calculated how it might appear to any Death Eater who heard the story secondhand. A public antagonism was the best disguise for his protection. Yet the resemblance to James was more than skin deep. The boy had inherited the same impulse toward defiance, the same inability to let an insult pass unanswered. In class, Potter's retorts were not always clever, but they carried enough of his father's tone to ignite Severus's temper. It became a perverse sort of balance. Each cutting remark from the teacher sharpened the boy's stubbornness, and each flash of the boy's resistance gave Severus another reason to keep him close enough to watch. Privately, he monitored more than the boy knew. Information from the staff, overheard gossip in the corridors, the small tells that marked who his friends were, where he wandered, and when he broke rules. He learned the patterns of Potter's days with the same precision he brought to brewing, who he partnered with in herbology, how quickly he grasped charms, how carelessly he left his bag open in the common spaces. It was all data, filed and ready for use. There were moments, unplanned, unwanted, when the boy's face, lit by candlelight or turned in sudden concentration, blurred the distinction between James and Lily. Those moments were dangerous, prying at the armor he had built. He countered them with deliberate severity, issuing detentions for infractions others might have ignored, docking points with the efficiency of someone keeping a ledger. To the staff, he was simply maintaining order. To the students, he was fulfilling the role they had already written for him in whispers, the bitter Slytherin professor, relentless with Gryffindors, harsher still with Potter. To Dumbledore, he was doing exactly what was required, keeping the boy under watch, close enough to intervene should the shadows of war creep through the castle gates. Evenings found him in his quarters, the fire throwing long shadows across shelves of glass and leather. Reports to Dumbledore were delivered in measured tones, each detail sifted for what was useful. He never lingered after giving them. The headmaster had a talent for looking past the mask, and it was not a gaze Severus welcomed for long. Still, the vow he had made bound him, and he kept it with the precision of a man accustomed to working with volatile elements. Protect the boy. Endure the boy. Endure what the boy reminded him of. The irony was not lost on him. The most important work of his life would be performed under the guise of antagonism, and the only person who might ever understand the truth was gone. In time, Potter's presence became another fixture of the castle, like the shifting staircases or the echo of the ghosts. Yet even as the years moved forward, Severus never allowed himself to forget that the boy was more than a student. He was a living fulcrum on which the outcome of the war might tilt. And Severus Snape, teacher, Death Eater, spy, would remain the thorn in his side for as long as it took to keep him alive. Because safety, in this game, was never given. It was guarded, fiercely and without acknowledgement, in the shadows where the mask and the man were one and the same. Secrecy had begun as a means of survival, it matured into a profession. The work did not resemble the romantic nonsense in popular tales. It was schedules, signals, redundancies, and an accounting ledger of risks that never balanced. In the margins lived all the ways a man could be discovered, a glance held a second too long, a hesitation in a corridor, a word chosen for sound rather than tactical value. Severus learned to subtract those margins until only function remained. In the First War, intelligence gathering often meant standing close enough to smell the smoke of what he could not stop. Houses burned because someone believed fear was instructive, names disappeared from the prophet because terror required examples. Severus took note of locations, methods, and participants. He remembered the order in which wands were drawn and the preferred patterns of attack, the way certain killers favored precision while others chose spectacle. The notes were never written in the same hand twice, never stored in one place, never moved along a route he could be forced to repeat. Dumbledore received them not as confessions but as raw material for countermeasures. The dark mark linked him to a network of summons and expectations. The burn on his forearm provided no warning beyond pain, no explanation beyond command. He learned to leave a room without leaving a trace of disruption, to appear among masked figures as if gravity itself had pulled him there. In those circles, he found a curriculum of brutality disguised as strategy. He studied it without endorsement, isolating the parts that mattered, who gave orders when the leader was absent, who improvised when a plan broke, which alliances were transactional and which were devotional. Information, harvested and cleaned of sentiment, moved the other way under cover of ordinary days. Trust, on both sides, was a performance measured in consistencies. With Death Eaters, he maintained a reputation for discipline and results, nothing ostentatious, nothing that invited envy. With the Order, he delivered utility stripped of comfort. There were no guarantees. There were only gains and losses measured in lives, and the ledger rarely showed profit. Dumbledore's faith did not lighten the work, it only clarified its necessity. When the Dark Lord fell and the mark cooled to a scar, the world did not reward the quiet labor of betrayal. It seldom does. Trials were held, names were named, and clemency was apportioned according to whichever narrative the ministry found most useful that week. Severus did not stand in a courtroom because an older man argued that utility can be a form of virtue when there are too few virtuous men to do what must be done. The acquittal did not absolve him. It only returned him to a life where the visible portion of his work was grading essays that misunderstood the difference between infusion and decoction. Years passed in a tense equilibrium. The castle's cycles, sorting, feasts, exams, resumed their familiar sequence, and the war receded into lecture notes and the private discipline of keeping skills from rusting. Then the mark stirred again, a phantom itch sharpening to pain, and the air of Britain changed as if a pressure system had shifted. The rebirth happened elsewhere, to other witnesses, the summons reached him with the old, brutal clarity. He answered because not answering was a form of confession. Reentry to the circle was a second audition. Allegiances were remeasured, absences tallied, usefulness recalculated. He arrived with the simple fact of his survival and the plausible claim of proximity to the headmaster. In that calculus, proximity outweighed zeal. The role that had kept him alive, bitter teacher, credibly self-interested, now served as the credentials that allowed him back into rooms where plans regained their old velocity. From that point forward, the labor became a braid of obligations. Reports moved to Dumbledore in the same unadorned language, schedules, movements, resources, intentions inferred from patterns and phrasing. Reports moved back to the Dark Lord in equal measure, salted with truths that misled and omissions that steered. Each message had to be exactly strong enough to convince its recipient of the messenger's value and exactly weak enough to prevent catastrophe. Precision ceased to be a virtue and became an existential requirement. Suspicion was a companion that never slept. Among Death Eaters, he answered questions with the patience of a scholar and the fatigue of a bureaucrat, letting the performance of weariness stand in for the performance of loyalty. Among allies, he bore scrutiny that felt more invasive because it came from the hopeful side. Belligerence from enemies could be ignored, faith from friends, never fully. On both fronts he practiced occlumency until the act of presenting a thought became indistinguishable from the act of manufacturing one. Meetings took place in cellars that remembered older wars, in drawing rooms where gilded frames watched unblinking, in forests that absorbed sound and returned only breath. He learned to catalogue the texture of those spaces because spaces betray men. A gilded room encouraged preening, a cellar encouraged candor, a forest encouraged certainty. He used those tendencies the way he used ingredients in a complex brew, measured, combined, heat applied only when required. Close calls arrived on a predictable schedule that never felt predictable in the moment. A masked colleague lingered a shade too long at his shoulder, a question repeated with a fractional shift in wording, a corridor intersected by an unanticipated patrol. Each event demanded an answer that solved the immediate problem and reinforced the larger fiction. Improvisation, if it was to succeed, needed to look like habit. At Hogwarts, the visible portion of life contracted into stricter lines. Discipline in class provided necessary camouflage, isolation outside of it prevented accidents. The faculty saw a man tightening as the world loosened. Students saw a deeper cruelty that fit their stories of him. Both perceptions were instruments in a larger orchestration. Every scowl purchased a scrap of freedom elsewhere. When the order reconstituted, the house at the edge of a square became a switchboard. Assignments were distributed with the clipped efficiency of wartime administration. Severus arrived as the member whose reliability was measured by output rather than camaraderie. He delivered results and declined the currency of fellowship. Even there, where his work mattered most, he avoided threads that could be pulled by anyone curious enough to tug. The boy at the center of it all remained a constant variable. Protection required perimeter awareness. Who watched him, who resented him, who could be used to reach him? Patterns formed the way they always did, slowly, then all at once. He learned which teachers would look away and which students could be cajoled or frightened into silence, which rumors to smother and which to feed so that more dangerous ones would starve. Nothing about this resembled sentiment. Everything about it resembled logistics. Occasionally, the machinery jammed. A message failed to arrive. A courier turned frightened and unreliable. A plan premised on secrecy collided with teenage bravado. In those instances, the decisions were quick, unsentimental, and remembered later with the gravity they deserved. The work of a spy is not the arrangement of events but the reduction of harm when events misbehave. Through it all, Snape maintained a ledger only he could read. On one side, lives diverted from danger, plots delayed, attacks blunted, resources misallocated by an enemy nudged a few degrees off course. On the other, the corrosions accepted in payment, trust forfeited, reputation weaponized against himself, opportunities for kindness traded for operational cover. The balance never cleared. It was not designed to. By the time winter settled over Britain again, intelligence had coalesced into a conclusion: the next phase would require more than misdirection. It would require an act that could not be rehearsed without becoming impossible, an act that would finalize his standing with one side and obliterate it with the other. The plan belonged to Dumbledore, but the cost would be his. Preparation began in the quietest possible way, by removing from his life anything that might interfere with execution. Attachments that had never been allowed to form were spared the indignity of being severed. Spying, in the end, proved to be a discipline of subtraction. Remove vanity, and the urge to be understood goes with it. Remove convenience, and habit becomes a weapon. Remove hope, and duty sharpens. What remains is a single line traced through darkness, narrow, exact, and straight enough to carry a man from one side of a war to the other without leaving a visible footprint, until the moment comes when a footprint must be left, deep enough for history to find. Occlumency was not a subject taught in the Hogwarts curriculum. It was an art practiced in the margins, learned under conditions that discouraged questions. For Severus, it had been a necessity long before it became a formal discipline. The principle was simple enough: prevent intrusion. The execution, however, was closer to war than to study. In its purest form, Occlumency was the rebuilding of the mind into something with corridors, locked doors, and dead ends. Thoughts were rearranged so that a casual searcher would see only what was meant to be seen: an emotional decoy, a curated memory, a harmless lie offered in place of the dangerous truth. The rest of the mind's contents were stored deeper, behind layers of misdirection that could withstand persistent assault. It was not unlike designing a labyrinth whose walls could shift while the intruder was still inside. For years, Severus had practiced the craft privately, honing it into a reflex. As a spy, it was his most valuable weapon. As a man with enemies on both sides, it was the difference between life and a very public death. Voldemort's return had sharpened the need. The Dark Lord was a master of legilimency, and every summons carried the possibility of interrogation. A poorly-placed thought, Lily's face, Dumbledore's trust, a single glimpse of Harry Potter not as a pawn but as a charge, would have been enough to undo everything. It was, then, with a kind of grim irony that Dumbledore tasked him with teaching Occlumency to Potter. The boy was a magnet for the Dark Lord's attention, his mind an unlocked door in a street full of thieves. If the connection between them could be exploited, Harry could be manipulated, misled, or destroyed outright. Occlumency was meant to seal that door. The lessons were an exercise in controlled hostility. In the dim light of Severus's office, with the fire throwing long shadows across shelves of bottled ingredients, the air between teacher and pupil was taut with mutual dislike. The boy resisted in ways both deliberate and unconscious, resentment sharpening his tone, curiosity pulling his focus, pride making him slow to admit failure. Severus responded with the precision of a surgeon and the severity of a guard at the gate, probing and dismantling the boy's defenses until they could be rebuilt with stronger walls. When the connection between Harry and the Dark Lord flared unexpectedly, the risk was immediate. Images bled through, glimpses of corridors, locked doors, flashes of emotion too strong to be entirely Harry's own. Severus recognized the danger in those visions. Not just the potential for the Dark Lord to see into the boy's mind, but for the boy to see into the Dark Lord's. Curiosity was as dangerous a weakness as fear, and Harry had both. Outside the lessons, Severus doubled his own practice. Each night, before sleep, he walked the corridors of his mind, reinforcing old walls, repairing doors battered by the day's events. He reviewed memories like an archivist, ensuring the decoys were in place and the real treasures buried under layers of the ordinary and the unimportant. Even Dumbledore was never shown the full map. Trust had limits, even when earned. The work was exhausting in ways that brewing or spellcraft could never be. Brewing required patience and precision, spellcraft, skill and willpower. Occlumency required self-erasure, the suppression of instinct, the deliberate concealment of one's own humanity. Over time, it was easy to forget which memories were genuine and which had been arranged as bait. In Harry, he saw both the necessity and the futility of the task. Necessity, because a single moment of weakness could be fatal. Futility, because the boy carried too much of James's arrogance and Lily's stubbornness to submit entirely to the discipline. The lessons became another kind of battleground between them, fought in silence and sudden flashes of intrusion, each emerging more resentful than before. And yet, despite the friction, or perhaps because of it, Severus persisted. Every barrier he helped the boy build was another layer between Harry and the Dark Lord's reach. Whether Harry understood that protection or not was irrelevant. The vow Severus had made did not require acknowledgement. It required results. In the end, Occlumency was not about keeping the Dark Lord out. It was about keeping the truth in. And for Severus Snape, that had always been the truest work of all. The winter's night was still enough to hear the snow falling, the sound more suggestion than substance. Spinner's End, choked in shadow, seemed untouched by the war that was tightening its hold elsewhere. But Severus knew better. He had come here precisely because war reached even into the forgotten streets. Narcissa Malfoy's knock was not the kind of visitor's announcement that invited refusal. Her presence, pale and taut with desperation, brought the reality of Voldemort's plans into the dim, firelit room. Draco had been given a task dressed up as honor but intended as punishment: assassinate Albus Dumbledore. It was a sentence disguised as an opportunity, a means of drawing blood without dirtying the Dark Lord's own hands. Narcissa's voice, low but edged with panic, made the request sound less like a plea and more like the invocation of a right. Protect her son. Ensure the task was completed, should Draco falter. The conditions were not abstract. Voldemort's displeasure was swift and terminal, and Draco's failure, almost certain, would not only cost his life but his family's place in the ranks. Bellatrix Lestrange watched from the shadows, suspicion radiating from her like heat. Her distrust was both personal and ideological. She believed loyalty must be loud, performative, reinforced by acts of cruelty. Severus's quieter, more deliberate methods had never satisfied her. She challenged every word that passed between him and Narcissa, testing the air for signs of false allegiance. The vow itself was ancient magic, older than any of the allegiances Severus had sworn before. The clasping of hands was almost ceremonial, the wand's pointer needle threading invisible cords between them. Narcissa's voice trembled as she named the terms: protect Draco, watch over him, and, if necessary, carry out the task in his place. Severus repeated each one, binding himself in more than words. The magic surged with each promise, searing itself into the air and into his marrow. The final cord tightened with the last vow, the one that would one day demand he strike down Dumbledore. The flare of power in the closing moment was not unlike the burning of the Dark Mark, but heavier, anchored in a truth magic itself would enforce. Break this vow, and his life would be the price. Bellatrix's gaze lingered on him even after the vow was complete, her satisfaction sharpened by the belief she had cornered him into a commitment that would test his loyalty beyond dispute. Severus allowed her to think it. She would not imagine that Dumbledore already knew, or that the man's own designs would fold this dangerous magic into a larger, colder plan. When the two witches left, the silence returned, but it no longer felt like the silence of the room. It was the silence of a door closing somewhere deep within the path he had chosen years ago. The vow had fixed the endpoint, the only work left was in managing the route to it. Severus stood at the window, watching the snow blur the outlines of the street. The vow sat in his chest like a second heartbeat, steady and inescapable. He had committed himself to an act that would define his standing on both sides of the war, though not in the same way. In the months ahead, Draco's shadow would be a constant presence in the corridors of Hogwarts. The boy would move with the forced arrogance of someone hiding fear, his eyes scanning for exits he could not admit to needing. And Severus, bound by magic and by the headmaster's request, would walk behind him, part protector, part executioner, waiting for the moment when one role would consume the other. The headmaster's summons came without urgency in the phrasing, but urgency in the fact of it. Dumbledore rarely called him to the high, glass-walled office unless the matter was one they could not afford to leave in passing. By the time Severus arrived, the night beyond the windows had deepened to the blue-black of ink, the stars sharp against it. On the desk between them lay the ring. It was blackened, fractured along lines that suggested violence rather than age, and the stone at its center, once whole, was now a dull, unyielding fragment. The air around it carried a wrongness, as if the thing were still breathing its curse. Dumbledore's hand, swathed in blackened flesh and splintered with enchantments, rested beside it. The damage, Severus saw immediately, was the work of magic older and more cunning than most wizards could hope to defend against. curses of that depth were designed not merely to kill but to make the act of living in the meantime a slow, precise disintegration. Even with his skill, there was no undoing it, only delaying the inevitable. And delay, he told the headmaster, was possible, but it would not be indefinite. Dumbledore took the news without visible reaction, his gaze settling on Severus with the kind of stillness that carried weight. The conversation that followed was stripped of the elaborate verbal sparring they sometimes indulged in. The headmaster, who could shape a student's life with the gentlest redirection, spoke plainly. He was dying. It would be months, not years. Then came the request. When the time arrived, Severus was to be the one to end it, swiftly, without spectacle, in a way that spared Draco from having to carry the Dark Lord's impossible task to its conclusion. The unbreakable vow had ensured Severus's death if he refused, but Dumbledore's voice made it clear this was not about the vow. It was about control over the manner of his own end, over the way the Dark Lord's plans would play out, and over how Severus would be positioned in the aftermath. It was a request that contained within it several others. Kill me. Protect the boy. Maintain your place in the Dark Lord's trust. Keep the Order informed. Make your own name more despised than it already is, so that no one will guess where your loyalties truly lie. Severus understood each of these instructions without them needing to be named. They discussed contingencies in the same tone they might have used to discuss the brewing of a complex potion, step by step, conditions clearly stated, outcomes accounted for. The difference was that in this brew, Severus himself was the final ingredient. When the conversation ended, Dumbledore's thanks was not gratitude in the usual sense but an acknowledgement of shared understanding. They were both, in their own ways, men who had learned to use the pieces left on the board, however broken. Leaving the office, Severus felt the night air colder than it had been on arrival. The vow, the curse, and the headmaster's plan had converged into a single, unalterable point in the near future. Every act from now until then would be measured against its contribution to that moment. In the months to come, he would have to guard Draco more closely, keep the boy's fear from curdling into recklessness, and maintain the fiction that he was circling the headmaster like a vulture. The thought did not trouble him, his life had been built on fictions. But this one, he knew, would leave a mark even Occlumency could not hide. When the moment finally came and the headmaster fell from the astronomy tower, the castle did not sleep for days. Even those who had hated Dumbledore walked the corridors in a daze, their grief sharpened by disbelief. In the echo of the spell, Severus became what the world believed he had always been, a murderer, Voldemort's most loyal servant, the man who had betrayed the only wizard many thought incorruptible. It was the perfect disguise. The summer that followed was a careful campaign of redefinition. When September came and the Sorting Hat sang its verses to a hall held in collective breath, it was Severus Snape who sat in the headmaster's chair. The students saw a figure draped in black, severe as ever, his expression revealing nothing of the cost behind the elevation. The faculty saw a man whose authority they could not challenge without aligning themselves openly against the new regime. The Carrows saw a superior willing to grant them leash enough to indulge their cruelties, not knowing that leash was also a noose. Hogwarts under his command became a place of constant tension. The Carrows, Amicus with his brutish swagger, Alecto with her relish for humiliation, patrolled the corridors and turned discipline into theatre. Detentions were no longer lines and polishing trophies, they were endurance trials in pain. The younger students learned to keep their heads down, the older ones learned to keep their mouths shut, and resistance found its voice only in whispers. Severus moved through this atmosphere as both conductor and saboteur. To the Carrows, he was an ally who gave them wide remit. To the students, he was the same unforgiving figure he had always been, only now with unchallenged power to enforce it. But behind closed doors, some punishments were quietly reassigned, some detentions quietly shortened, some names quietly removed from lists before they reached the wrong hands. Each act of mitigation had to be small enough to escape notice yet meaningful enough to matter. Protecting a student openly would have been as good as signing their death warrant. Protecting them invisibly was an art. Sometimes it meant ordering them to the hospital wing for an invented infraction rather than allowing them to face a Carrows brand of discipline. Sometimes it meant assigning extra work that would keep them in the library during a raid. The students never knew which interventions were deliberate. They only knew the headmaster's eye was always on them. Among the faculty, alliances shifted with caution. Some, like McGonagall, met his gaze with open defiance, their contempt undisguised. Others kept their distance, unsure whether the man they once worked beside had crossed the line into full allegiance with the Dark Lord. Severus let them believe whatever served their survival best. It was easier for them to act against him if they thought they were defying a villain. The castle itself seemed to resist the new order. Staircases misbehaved more frequently, the wards felt heavier, and the air in the great hall seemed colder despite the fires. It was as though the stones knew that their guardian was gone and that the man in his place was fighting a war no one could see. In private, Severus felt the weight of the headmaster's office not in its trappings, the shelves of ancient books, the telescope, the perches for owls, but in the constant need to be 3 steps ahead of every gaze. The Carrows reported to him daily. Death Eaters arrived with messages or orders to be carried out within the school, and Dumbledore's portrait, high above, offered counsel that was as much test as guidance. Every decision was an equation in survival, of himself, of the students, of the role he played in the war. The month stretched in this balance, each day another move on a chessboard where the pieces were lives. His reputation, already tarnished beyond repair, deepened into infamy. It was the shield he needed. The more the world hated him, the more effective his protection became. No one would suspect the hand they feared was also the one holding the knife away from their backs. And so, through that long and bitter year, Severus Snape, headmaster, murderer, double agent, walked the thin edge between the part he played and the truth he could never allow to be seen. Every step brought him closer to the endgame he had already agreed to play, the final act written the night Dumbledore had made his request. And when that act came, it would be as public as the murder that had put him in the chair, and just as misunderstood. There are masks one wears for an evening, and masks one wears until the skin beneath has forgotten its shape. Severus's was the latter, a face the world had learned to hate so thoroughly that it no longer questioned what lay behind it. That was its power, and its curse. Every step of his life had been an exchange, part of himself traded for a measure of safety, another part surrendered for the illusion of control. As a boy, he had traded his softness for cunning, because in his home softness had teeth sunk into it. At school, he had traded vulnerability for knowledge, because the L. Bibraris quiet was more forgiving than his peers. Later, he traded truth for allegiance, first to the Dark Lord, then to Dumbledore, each vow another stitch in the tapestry that now bound him. By the time he sat in the headmaster's chair, there was almost nothing left that had not been bartered away. The students saw a tyrant, the Death Eaters saw a peer, the Order saw a traitor, and no one saw the man who was still fighting, in his own sharp-edged way, for the promise made long ago to a girl by the river. The tragedy was not only that the promise had outlived the girl, it was that keeping it required him to destroy himself entirely in the eyes of everyone else. The mask had to remain flawless. A crack, even a small one, would invite questions, and questions were as fatal as curses in the world he inhabited. But to wear it without pause meant that the role became the reality, at least to those outside the fortress of his mind. They could not see the moments in the dead of night when he sat alone, wondering if he was still the man Lily had known, or if that man had drowned quietly under the weight of necessity. It was a lonely war, and loneliness was not a byproduct, it was the design. Isolation made him harder to read, harder to reach, harder to hurt through others. But it also meant that there was no one to witness the truth, and no one to remember it when he was gone. That was the unspoken cost. To save what mattered, he had to allow himself to be remembered for the worst thing he had done, rather than the reason he had done it. The end was coming, he had always known that. The vow's pulse in his veins, the headmaster's last request, the precarious balance of his position, all of it pointed to a single, unavoidable conclusion. He would fulfill his role to the last, but the reward for it would not be vindication. It would be silence. And perhaps that was why his life had always seemed like a punishment without parole. Every victory was invisible, every sacrifice misread, every act of courage recorded as treachery. In the world's eyes, he would never be a hero. In his own, that was the point. When the final act arrived, it would come swiftly, in the shadow of war's chaos. His enemies would rejoice, his allies would doubt, and the truth would be buried under the rubble of a world rebuilt without him. That was the cost of the mask. That was the life of Severus Snape. And the mask, once in place, would not be lifted, not even at the end. The night broke not with darkness, but with sound. The castle's walls, which had held centuries of whispers and laughter, now shook under the weight of siege. From the vantage point of the headmaster's tower, Severus could see the flicker of spells carving arcs of light across the grounds, hear the distant rhythm of explosions where wards met curses, and feel the pressure in the air as magic gathered and clashed. The battle had come sooner than he had hoped, but exactly as he had expected. Students were no longer simply pupils, they were fighters, runners, messengers. The order had returned in force, reclaiming the halls with urgency, and the Death Eaters had answered with equal fervor. The corridors became trenches, the classrooms barricades, the Great Hall a war council. For Severus, the calculus of survival had shifted. For nearly 2 years, his work had been to slow the bleeding, to hide what could be saved, to keep the Carrows' cruelty from crushing the students beyond repair. Now, the only way to protect anyone was to step directly into the fire, knowing the flames had been meant for him all along. His path at night was narrow and exacting. He needed to reach Potter, needed to pass on the one piece of truth that mattered before the end, but the castle itself had become a maze of shifting dangers. Death Eaters moved through the stairwells like hunting dogs, and the Order's fighters, many of them his former colleagues, would not hesitate to strike him down on sight. His survival depended on being feared by both sides for just a few moments longer. When the summons came, it was not from an ally, but from the Dark Lord himself. Voldemort was in the Shrieking shack, the command laced with the kind of false calm that always preceded violence. Severus understood the reason before he crossed the threshold. The Elder Wand had not been yielding its full allegiance to Voldemort. In the Dark Lord's mind, the problem was the wand's loyalty to its last master. That master was Dumbledore. And the man who had killed Dumbledore, Severus Snape, stood before him now. The logic was precise, and fatally flawed. The wand's true allegiance was a knot of rules older than the Dark Lord's arrogance could comprehend, but Voldemort's conclusion was enough to seal Severus's fate. There would be no duel. No speech. Only Nagini, coiled and ready, her cage and execution chamber. As the serpent struck, pain lanced through Severus, not just from the bite, but from the sudden, narrowing certainty that his time had collapsed into seconds. It was then that he saw Potter in the doorway, the boy's face shadowed, his eyes burning with something between hate and confusion. There was no time for reconciliation, no time to explain the years, the masks, the vows. There was only time to give him what mattered, the memories, each one a thread in the tapestry the boy did not yet know he was part of. They spilled from him like breath, fragments of Lily's laughter, Dumbledore's plans, the truths hidden in the spaces between his worst acts. The last thing he saw was not the boy, nor the Dark Lord, nor the walls of the shack. It was green eyes, Lily's eyes, looking back at him one final time, though they were set in a face that would never understand the whole of what had been done in their name. And then there was nothing. The mask had not slipped, even at the end. The world outside would remember him as it always had, a traitor, a killer, a man who deserved the death he met. Only one person now carried the truth forward, and even that truth was a weapon, not a eulogy. The battle roared on, the castle still standing, its stones heavy with the weight of another name that would never be carved into its list of heroes. The war ended in the grey light of dawn, the castle a fractured silhouette against a sky that had not yet decided whether to rain or clear. Smoke drifted in the air like the ghosts of spells, and the scent of dust and ash clung to every breath. The dead were gathered in rows, their bodies marked not by rank or allegiance but by the final stillness that made them all the same. Some names would be carved into stone. Some stories would be told in the years to come, passed down as proof that bravery had lived here. Others would vanish in the quiet between retellings. Severus Snape's name was not carved anywhere, and his story, what little of it was known, was too tangled, too inconvenient to fit neatly into the war's official ending. Potter had spoken to a select few, passing on what the memories had shown him. Among those who heard, there was a shift, not enough to rewrite the past, but enough to change the tilt of a thought before it became judgment. Minerva McGonagall, standing in the ruined courtyard, gave orders for his body to be recovered from the Shrieking shack, and though no ceremony marked its removal, there was a quiet precision to the task, as if even the stones knew they were carrying a burden the world would never understand. His belongings, what little he had, were sorted without sentiment. The potions laboratory was stripped, the office he had once claimed returned to the school, the private quarters emptied. No one spoke of where his wand went, or what became of the books in his personal library. In the official tally, his death was listed without embellishment, killed in battle. The rest was left to speculation. The truth, for those who had glimpsed it, was heavy to hold. They knew that every cruelty he had shown had been a mask, every hateful word a shield, every dangerous alliance a calculated risk. They knew the life he had lived was one long narrowing corridor, ending in a door he had chosen to walk through because it was the only way to keep his promise. But truth in war is a fragile thing. Without public proof, without an eager audience, it fades, replaced by the cleaner, more convenient version of events. And so the world moved on, building its peace on the bones of those it would remember and those it would not. Somewhere in that new peace, a portrait might have been commissioned, placed in a corner of the castle where few ventured. Or perhaps not, perhaps his face lived only in the minds of those who had seen both the mask and the man beneath it. History would not call him a hero. Songs would not be sung in his name. Children would not learn of his sacrifice in classrooms. But the ones who knew carried it like a private oath, an unspoken acknowledgement that the victory they now lived in had been purchased, in part, by a man who had never once asked to be thanked. And so the war ended, and the world healed. But in the silence between the lines of its history, the truth remained, sharp and unyielding. It had always sucked to be Severus Snape. And that, perhaps, was what made his victories matter most. Severus Snape's life, when viewed as a whole, is a study in unrelieved sacrifice without the promise of redemption. His story is not the clean arc of a hero's journey, it is the anatomy of a man who bore the burdens of both sides in a war, yet belonged fully to neither. From the beginning, he was marked by disadvantage, a broken home that taught him mistrust before it taught him language, a childhood where escape was found not in joy but in survival. His brilliance was his weapon, but it also isolated him, setting him apart from the very people he wished would see him as more than the boy from Spinner's End. At Hogwarts, he found the one person who gave him a glimpse of warmth, Lily Evans. Only to lose her through a combination of his own mistakes and the ruthless social divides of the wizarding world. That loss became the axis upon which his entire adult life turned. His allegiance to Voldemort, his betrayal, his penance under Dumbledore, each decision was a desperate attempt to protect her or atone for her death. But atonement in this case was never going to bring peace, it was only going to chain him to an endless series of impossible tasks. His double life was its own torment. As a Death Eater, he was expected to commit atrocities. As a member of the Order of the Phoenix, he was required to watch those atrocities and sometimes participate, all to preserve his cover. Every act of goodness had to be hidden, every act of cruelty had to be visible. He became a man the world despised not because he was that man, but because it was the only way to protect the very people who hated him. When Dumbledore asked him to be the instrument of his death, it bound Severus to an ending that guaranteed infamy. Killing the only person who truly understood him in the eyes of both friend and foe meant the mask would become permanent. There would be no moment in the sun after the war, no speech to clear his name, no applause for a job done well. His victory would be defined by the fact that no one could ever know it was his. As headmaster, he walked the knife's edge between protecting the students and appearing to facilitate their suffering. Each small act of kindness had to be buried under layers of cruelty. In doing so, he isolated himself entirely, living in the knowledge that his every choice was eroding whatever remained of the boy Lily once knew. His death in the Shrieking Shack was swift but not clean. Even in his final moments, he could not tell Harry Potter the full truth, only give him the pieces, trusting the boy would understand. That trust was all he had left to gamble, and even that was taken from him when his name failed to earn a place among the war's recognized heroes. In the end, the reason it sucked to be Severus Snape is simple. He gave everything and received nothing in return, not even the dignity of being remembered for what he truly was. His triumphs were invisible, his sacrifices unacknowledged, his motivations misunderstood. He was condemned to play the villain so convincingly that, when the curtain fell, the audience still believed it. The world got its victory. He got silence. And that silence was the truest, most bitter mark of the life he had lived. If this story has stirred something in you, or whether it's comfort, wonder, or that spark of imagination that keeps you listening, then I'd like to invite you to be part of what comes next. My vision for this channel is simple, but ambitious, to create the most immersive, most unforgettable sleep stories on YouTube. Tales that aren't just background noise, but the highlight of your night. From deep dives into Star Wars lore, to intimate Harry Potter diary entries, to reimagined classics like Cinderella or Little Red Riding Hood, each one crafted with care, brought to life with professional voices, rich soundscapes, and production that feels like stepping into another world. But to make that happen, I need your help. And it's easier than you think. Like this video, so the YouTube algorithm shares it with more dreamers like you. Comment, tell me what you loved, what you want next, or even share your own story ideas. Share, send it to a friend who loves to escape into a good tale. Subscribe, so you're here from the very beginning, part of this journey as it grows. Every click, every like, comment, share, and subscription pushes us closer to monetization. And once we're there, I can bring in talented voice actors, expand the story library, and create production so immersive you'll forget you're listening through headphones. This isn't just bedtime storytelling. It's building a home for dreamers, readers, and lovers of fantasy from every corner of the world. So, if this story has made your night a little brighter, please take a moment, right now, to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Together, we can create something magical. Sweet dreams. I'll see you in the next story.